In the grand theater of human interaction, there exists a fundamental truth that most people discover too late in life: predictability is the enemy of respect. When others can map your responses, anticipate your moves, and forecast your reactions with clockwork precision, they begin to treat you not as a formidable force to be reckoned with, but as a known quantity to be managed, manipulated, or simply ignored. Marcus had learned this lesson the hard way. For 32 years of his life, he had been the epitome of predictability. His colleagues knew exactly how he would respond to criticism, with nervous laughter and immediate accommodation. His family knew precisely which buttons to push when they needed something from him: guilt about his childhood, reminders of family loyalty, subtle implications that he owed them for past sacrifices. His friends understood that Marcus would always be the one to apologize first, to smooth over conflicts, to bend his schedule around everyone else's needs. This predictability had earned him a reputation as reliable and easygoing, but beneath those seemingly positive labels lay a more uncomfortable truth: he had become invisible in plain sight. At work meetings, his suggestions were politely acknowledged and then ignored. In social gatherings, conversations continued around him as if he were furniture. Even his romantic relationships followed the same pattern. Partners initially drawn to his stability soon became comfortable taking his presence for granted, secure in the knowledge that Marcus would always be there, always accommodating, always predictable. The transformation began on a Tuesday morning that seemed no different from any other. Marcus had arrived at the office early, as was his custom, preparing for the weekly strategy meeting where his ideas would once again be overlooked in favor of more aggressive proposals from his more confident colleagues. But something inside him had shifted during the previous weekend, crystallized by an offhand comment from his sister about how Marcus never causes any trouble for anyone. The comment had been meant as a compliment, but it had landed like a physical blow. Never causes trouble. The phrase echoed in his mind with increasing intensity. When had causing no trouble become his defining characteristic? When had being predictable become the sum total of his identity? As his colleagues filed into the conference room, Marcus made a decision that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of his life. When the marketing director presented what everyone assumed would be the winning proposal for their new campaign, Marcus did something unprecedented: he tore it apart with surgical precision. "This approach is fundamentally flawed," he said, his voice carrying a weight that made everyone in the room stop and stare. "We're chasing demographics that stopped being relevant 5 years ago, using messaging that sounds like it was written by committee, which it was. If we implement this strategy, we'll burn through our budget producing content that our target audience will scroll past without a second thought." The silence that followed was deafening. The marketing director, accustomed to Marcus's usual deferential nods and gentle suggestions, stared at him as if he had suddenly sprouted wings. The CEO, who had been half listening while scrolling through emails, put down his phone and gave Marcus his full attention for the first time in months. "Do you have an alternative?" the CEO asked, and Marcus could hear the genuine curiosity in his voice, curiosity that had never been there before. Marcus did have an alternative, one he had been developing for months but had never found the courage to present. As he outlined his vision, he watched his colleagues' expressions shift from surprise to interest to something that looked remarkably like respect. By the end of the meeting, his proposal had been approved for immediate development, and Marcus found himself appointed as the project lead. The transformation wasn't immediate or complete, but it had begun. Over the following weeks, Marcus began to understand that his years of predictability had not been kindness or consideration; they had been a form of weakness that invited disrespect. By always being accommodating, he had trained everyone around him to expect accommodation. By never standing firm on his principles, he had communicated that he had no principles worth defending. The science behind this phenomenon is well documented in behavioral psychology. When humans encounter predictable patterns, our brains classify them as non-threatening and allocate minimal attention to them. This is an evolutionary adaptation that allows us to focus our limited cognitive resources on novel or potentially dangerous stimuli. In social contexts, this means that highly predictable people trigger what researchers call habituation response; they become background noise in the consciousness of others. Conversely, unpredictability triggers what psychologists term orienting response, an automatic focusing of attention accompanied by physiological arousal. When someone cannot predict how you will react, their brain must remain alert and engaged. This heightened attention translates into what we perceive as respect, but what is actually a form of cognitive caution. Marcus began to experiment with this principle in small ways. When a colleague attempted to dump an urgent project on his desk with the usual expectation that Marcus would simply accept it, he responded with calm firmness, "I can see this is important to you, but my current commitments make it impossible for me to take this on with the quality it deserves. Perhaps we should discuss redistributing some of my existing work, or you might consider approaching someone else." The colleague's reaction was immediate and telling. Instead of the frustrated acceptance that would have followed Marcus's predictable acquiescence, there was surprise, followed by a genuine negotiation about priorities and workload distribution. For the first time in his career, Marcus found himself being consulted about his capacity rather than having it simply assumed. This pattern repeated itself across every area of his life. When his mother called with her usual expectation that he would cancel his weekend plans to help with some non-urgent household project, Marcus responded with unexpected boundary setting, "I understand this is important to you, Mom, but I've already committed this weekend to something that matters to me. I'm happy to help you next weekend, or we could hire someone to handle it more quickly." The initial shock in his mother's voice was audible, but it was quickly followed by something Marcus had rarely heard from her: genuine consideration for his time and commitments. Within a month, their relationship had shifted from one of assumed availability to one of mutual respect for each other's schedules and priorities. The key insight Marcus was discovering is that unpredictability, when wielded skillfully, is not about being erratic or difficult. It's about refusing to allow others to take your responses for granted. It's about maintaining enough variability in your reactions that people must actually consider your perspective rather than simply assuming they know how you'll respond. This principle extends far beyond individual relationships into the realm of leadership and influence. History's most effective leaders have understood intuitively that predictability diminishes power while strategic unpredictability amplifies it. When subordinates, peers, or even superiors cannot confidently predict how a leader will respond to a given situation, they approach that leader with greater preparation, consideration, and respect. The corporate executive who sometimes responds to mistakes with understanding and, sometimes with swift consequences, keeps employees more engaged and accountable than one who is consistently harsh or consistently lenient. The negotiator who varies between accommodation and firmness achieves better outcomes than one who follows a predictable pattern. The parent who maintains loving consistency in values but unpredictability in specific responses raises more thoughtful children than one whose reactions can be gamed and manipulated. Marcus began to understand that his previous predictability had not been a virtue but an abdication of personal power. By always being the same, he had made himself dispensable. By never surprising anyone, he had ensured that no one found him particularly interesting or valuable. His reliability had become a cage, and the key to escaping it was the strategic deployment of unpredictability. The transformation required careful balance. Random unpredictability, being different just for the sake of being different, would have marked him as unstable rather than formidable. The unpredictability that commands respect is grounded in principle but variable in expression. It maintains core values while refusing to be pigeonholed into predictable responses. Marcus developed what he privately called his response portfolio, a range of potential reactions to common situations that prevented others from gaming his behavior. When faced with unreasonable requests, he might sometimes explain his reasoning in detail, sometimes simply say no without justification, and sometimes redirect the conversation to the requester's underlying needs. The key was that the specific response could not be predicted, even though all responses were grounded in his commitment to protecting his time, energy, and priorities. This strategic unpredictability began to pay dividends in unexpected ways. Colleagues started seeking his opinion on matters outside his direct expertise, curious about his perspective precisely because they couldn't predict what it would be. His social circle began to treat him as someone whose presence added value to gatherings rather than someone who simply filled space. Even strangers responded to him differently. Service professionals were more attentive, salespeople were more respectful, and everyday interactions carried a weight they had never possessed before. The psychological mechanism underlying this transformation is rooted in what researchers call intermittent reinforcement. When rewards or responses follow a predictable schedule, they quickly lose their impact. When they follow an unpredictable schedule, they maintain their power indefinitely. By becoming unpredictable, Marcus had unknowingly triggered this powerful psychological principle in his favor. But the most profound change was in how Marcus viewed himself. For 3 decades, he had defined his worth through his usefulness to others, measuring his value by how accommodating and predictable he could be. As he learned to embrace strategic unpredictability, he began to understand that his value lay not in his compliance but in his discernment, not in his predictability but in his depth. The respect he was earning from others was merely a reflection of the respect he was finally showing himself. By refusing to be taken for granted, he was communicating, both to himself and others, that he was someone worth considering carefully. By maintaining the element of surprise in his responses, he was asserting his right to be complex, multifaceted, and ultimately unknowable in his entirety. This realization set the stage for an even more fundamental transformation. If unpredictability could command respect from others, what would happen if he applied the same principle to his relationship with his own weaknesses? If others treated him with caution and respect when they couldn't predict his external responses, what would happen if his own limitations couldn't predict his internal responses to challenge and adversity? The question would prove more profound than Marcus could have imagined, opening the door to a deeper understanding of human strength and the paradoxical relationship between destruction and creation, between ending and beginning, between the death of oneself and the birth of another. Part 2, The Forge of Self-Destruction and Renewal. The journey from external unpredictability to internal transformation revealed itself to be far more treacherous and profound than Marcus had initially understood. While he had successfully disrupted others' ability to predict and control his responses, he began to recognize that his most predictable and destructive patterns were the ones he enacted upon himself. Every day, he could reliably predict exactly how he would respond to stress, failure, criticism, and challenge, with the same self-defeating behaviors that had defined him for decades. When faced with a difficult task, he would predictably procrastinate until panic forced action. When confronted with potential failure, he would reliably choose the safe path over the meaningful one. When criticized, he would consistently spiral into self-doubt and defensive justification. These internal patterns were as predictable as clockwork, and they had become the true prison that limited his potential far more than any external circumstance ever could. The revelation came during what should have been a moment of triumph. His innovative marketing campaign had exceeded all projected metrics, earning him recognition from senior leadership and a promotion offer that would fundamentally change his career trajectory. Instead of celebration, Marcus found himself consumed by familiar patterns of self-sabotage. He began questioning whether his success was deserved, whether he could handle the increased responsibility, whether he was fooling everyone including himself about his capabilities. For 3 sleepless nights, he rehearsed scenarios of failure, imagined ways the success was temporary or illusory, and constructed elaborate justifications for declining the promotion. The predictability of his own self-destructive response horrified him more than any external challenge ever had. Here he was, finally, earning the respect and opportunities he had always wanted, and his own internal programming was working overtime to snatch defeat from the jaws of victory. It was during this crisis that Marcus encountered a concept that would reshape his understanding of human strength and weakness, the idea that true power comes not from building up the self, but from systematically destroying the aspects of self that serve no constructive purpose. The weak self, the collection of limiting beliefs, self-defeating behaviors, and predictable responses to challenge, was not something to be managed or accommodated, but something to be deliberately and systematically eliminated. This realization was both terrifying and liberating. Terrifying because it meant acknowledging that much of what he had considered his identity was actually a collection of limitations masquerading as personality traits. Liberating because it suggested that these limitations were not fixed aspects of his nature but learned patterns that could be unlearned, behaviors that could be changed, beliefs that could be updated. The process of destroying his weak self began with careful observation and documentation. Marcus started maintaining what he privately called his weakness inventory, a detailed record of every moment when he acted from limitation rather than strength. When he chose comfort over growth, he noted it. When he allowed fear to masquerade as prudence, he documented it. When he sought validation instead of pursuing his own standards of excellence, he recorded it. The patterns that emerged were both predictable and shocking in their pervasiveness. He discovered that his weak self had colonized virtually every area of his life, creating a parallel universe of limitation that ran alongside his actual capabilities. While his competent self could handle complex strategic challenges at work, his weak self would convince him he wasn't qualified for leadership roles. While his capable self could build meaningful relationships, his weak self would sabotage them through jealousy, neediness, or premature withdrawal. The documentation phase lasted 3 months and filled 2 notebooks with observations. More importantly, it began to create distance between Marcus and his limiting patterns. By observing his weaknesses with scientific detachment rather than personal identification, he began to see them not as fundamental aspects of his identity but as learned behaviors that had outlived their usefulness. The next phase required something far more challenging than observation: active destruction of these patterns in real time. This meant developing new, unpredictable responses to his own internal triggers. When his weak self whispered that he wasn't qualified for a challenge, instead of his predictable spiral of self-doubt, he would respond with immediate action toward the challenge. When fear suggested he should choose the safe path, instead of his usual careful analysis of all the ways things could go wrong, he would deliberately choose the meaningful path and figure out the details as he went. The first major test came when he was offered the promotion he had nearly sabotaged. Instead of his predictable pattern of extensive deliberation disguised as due diligence, Marcus accepted immediately. The decision terrified his weak self, which immediately began generating elaborate scenarios of failure and embarrassment. Instead of engaging with these scenarios, Marcus treated them as he would treat any other irrelevant noise. He acknowledged their presence and continued with his work. This approach required developing what he began thinking of as response immunity, the ability to experience his weak self's predictable reactions without being controlled by them. When anxiety arose, instead of trying to eliminate it or being paralyzed by it, he learned to experience it as information while choosing his actions based on his values and goals rather than his comfort level. The transformation was neither smooth nor immediate. There were days when his weak self seemed to gain the upper hand, when old patterns reasserted themselves with surprising force. But Marcus had learned a crucial principle: the goal was not to never experience weakness, but to never be predictably controlled by weakness. Each time he chose a different response to an internal challenge, he was destroying his weak self's predictive power over his behavior. The psychological research supporting this approach is extensive. Neuroplasticity studies demonstrate that repeated behaviors literally rewire the brain, creating neural pathways that make certain responses more likely. By consistently choosing different responses to familiar triggers, Marcus was essentially rewiring his neural circuitry, making strength-based responses more automatic and weakness-based responses more effortful. 6 months into this process, something remarkable happened. Marcus realized that he could no longer predict his own responses to challenging situations. Where once he could reliably forecast that stress would trigger procrastination, criticism would trigger defensiveness, and opportunity would trigger self-sabotage, he now experienced genuine uncertainty about how he would handle difficult moments. This uncertainty was initially unsettling. If he couldn't predict his own responses, how could he plan or prepare? The answer came through experience. As his responses became less predictable to himself, they also became more creative, more appropriate to the specific situation, and more aligned with his actual values rather than his habitual patterns. Without the constraint of predictable weakness, he found himself capable of responses he had never imagined possible. When a major client criticized his new campaign, instead of his historical pattern of defensive explanation followed by excessive accommodation, Marcus found himself listening carefully, asking clarifying questions, and then either implementing valuable feedback or politely declining suggestions that didn't align with strategic goals. The client, clearly expecting a more predictable response, treated both Marcus and his work with newfound respect. When a personal relationship reached a crossroads that would have previously triggered his pattern of premature withdrawal disguised as giving the other person space, Marcus instead chose to lean into the discomfort, communicate his feelings directly, and work through the challenge collaboratively. The relationship not only survived but deepened in ways that would have been impossible under his old patterns. Most significantly, when faced with an opportunity to launch his own consulting practice, something his weak self had convinced him was too risky for years, Marcus found himself unable to predict whether he would choose safety or possibility. In that moment of uncertainty, freed from the tyranny of predictable self-limitation, he discovered his capacity for calculated courage. Within 3 months, he had left his corporate position and successfully launched a practice that combined his strategic expertise with his hard-won understanding of human behavior change. The destruction of his weak self had revealed something unexpected. His strong self was not a fixed entity waiting to be uncovered, but a dynamic capacity for growth, adaptation, and creative response to challenge. Without the predictable limitations of his weak self, his strong self was free to evolve, experiment, and exceed his own expectations. This realization brought Marcus to a profound understanding about the nature of human strength. Most people, he realized, are not destroyed by external challenges but by the predictable ways they respond to those challenges. The person who can be relied upon to give up when things get difficult will eventually face something difficult enough to defeat them. The person who predictably chooses comfort over growth will gradually diminish their capacity for handling anything uncomfortable. The person who consistently avoids risk will eventually become so risk-averse that even necessary changes become impossible. Conversely, the person who has systematically destroyed their predictable patterns of weakness becomes nearly indestructible, not because they never encounter challenges, but because their responses to challenges are no longer limited by previous limitations. They become unpredictable to their own weaknesses, making it impossible for old patterns to gain control over new situations. This principle extends far beyond individual psychology into the realm of organizational and social dynamics. Companies that can be predicted to respond to market challenges with cost-cutting, bureaucracy, and risk avoidance will eventually encounter challenges that these responses cannot address. Nations that predictably respond to threats with the same outdated strategies will eventually face threats that require adaptive innovation. But organizations and individuals who have systematically eliminated their predictable weaknesses, who have made themselves unknown quantities to their own limitations, possess a form of anti-fragility that allows them to grow stronger through challenge rather than being diminished by it. Marcus began to understand that this process of self-destruction was not a one-time event but an ongoing practice. Just as physical strength requires consistent exercise against resistance, psychological strength requires consistent destruction of emerging weaknesses before they can solidify into predictable patterns. He developed what he called weakness surveillance, a daily practice of identifying any emerging patterns of limitation and immediately disrupting them through alternative choices. When he noticed himself beginning to avoid difficult conversations, he would immediately initiate one. When he caught himself making decisions based on what others expected rather than what he valued, he would reverse the decision if possible or commit to different criteria for future choices. This constant vigilance against his own predictable limitations created a paradoxical form of freedom. By refusing to be predictable to himself, he had become capable of responses that were both more spontaneous and more intentional, both more creative and more consistent with his deepest values. The man who had once been entirely predictable to everyone, including himself, had become someone even he couldn't fully predict. And, in that unpredictability lay a form of power that no external force could diminish or destroy. Part 3, The Unassailable Foundation of Self-Created Strength. The culmination of Marcus's journey revealed the profound paradox at the heart of human strength. By systematically destroying the predictable weaknesses within himself, he had created something that external forces could never destroy because it existed beyond the reach of prediction and manipulation. The weak self that others could exploit, manipulate, or defeat had been replaced by a dynamic capacity for growth and response that confounded both external challenges and internal limitations. 2 years into his consulting practice, Marcus faced the ultimate test of this transformation. A former colleague, driven by professional jealousy and personal resentment, launched a calculated campaign to destroy Marcus's reputation and business. False accusations were made to clients, malicious rumors were spread throughout their professional network, and fabricated evidence of incompetence was circulated to potential partners. It was exactly the kind of sustained, personal attack that would have devastated his former self. The old Marcus would have responded predictably: desperate attempts at public defense, frantic damage control, emotional appeals for fairness, and, ultimately, a retreat from the field of battle. His weak self would have been predictably triggered by the accusations, predictably devastated by the betrayal, and predictably defeated by the sustained pressure. Anyone who knew the old Marcus could have forecast his response with mathematical precision. But the person facing this attack was no longer predictable, even to himself. Instead of the expected emotional spiral, Marcus found himself analyzing the situation with clinical detachment. Rather than rushing to defend himself against false accusations, he chose to let his work speak for itself. Instead of engaging in public disputes, he focused his energy on delivering exceptional value to existing clients and building relationships with new ones. Most remarkably, instead of viewing the attack as a threat to be repelled, Marcus recognized it as information to be utilized. His former colleague's campaign revealed weaknesses in Marcus's business model, gaps in his professional network, and vulnerabilities in his client relationships that he had been unaware of. Rather than defending against these revelations, Marcus began systematically addressing them, using the attack as a diagnostic tool for improving his practice. The response was so unexpected, so contrary to the predicted pattern of defense and counterattack, that it completely neutralized the effectiveness of the assault. Clients who might have been swayed by accusations instead witnessed Marcus's calm professionalism and consistent delivery. Professional contacts who heard rumors found them contradicted by their direct experience of Marcus's work and character. The attack that was designed to destroy him instead became a catalyst for strengthening every aspect of his professional life. Within 6 months, Marcus's business had grown by 40%, largely due to referrals from clients who had observed his grace under fire. The colleague who had attacked him had been marginalized by their own unprofessional behavior, their reputation damaged by the obvious disproportion between their accusations and Marcus's actual performance. The intended destruction had become unexpected construction. This experience crystallized Marcus's understanding of what it means to become truly unassailable. It's not about building walls thick enough to repel all attacks, or becoming so powerful that no one dares challenge you. True invincibility comes from becoming someone who cannot be predicted or controlled by external forces because you have eliminated your own predictable responses to those forces. The psychological principle underlying this phenomenon is profound. External attacks only succeed when they can trigger predictable internal responses. The person who can be relied upon to become defensive when criticized will be defeated by criticism. The person who predictably becomes aggressive when threatened will be defeated by threats. The person who consistently responds to pressure with stress will be defeated by pressure. But the person who has systematically destroyed their predictable responses to external challenges becomes like water. They adapt to the container of the challenge without being changed by it, flow around obstacles without being stopped by them, and find the path of least resistance without sacrificing their essential nature. Marcus began to understand that this principle operated at every level of human experience. In relationships, the person who could be predictably manipulated through guilt, fear, or desire would eventually be controlled by someone skilled in those manipulations. But the person who had eliminated their predictable responses to manipulation attempts became impossible to control through emotional leverage. In career contexts, the employee who could be predictably overloaded, overlooked, or exploited would eventually face all three fates. But the employee who had destroyed their predictable patterns of accommodation, invisibility, and acceptance of poor treatment would find themselves treated with consistent respect and consideration. In financial matters, the person with predictable spending patterns, predictable responses to pressure, and predictable reactions to opportunity would find themselves predictably struggling with money throughout their lives. But the person who had eliminated their predictable financial behaviors could adapt their strategy to any economic condition. The transformation required understanding a subtle but crucial distinction: consistency of values versus predictability of responses. Marcus had not become erratic or inconsistent in his core principles. He remained committed to excellence, integrity, and growth. But his specific responses to challenges, opportunities, and pressures had become unpredictable enough that others could not game his behavior or anticipate his choices. This unpredictability had created what military strategists call information asymmetry. Others had to act without knowing how he would respond, while he could observe their actions and choose his responses with full information. In any conflict or negotiation, the person operating with better information possesses a decisive advantage. The business applications of this principle proved extraordinary. When negotiating with clients, Marcus's unpredictable response patterns meant that the other party could not follow standard negotiation scripts or manipulation tactics. They had to engage with him authentically, which led to better outcomes for all parties. When dealing with difficult vendors or service providers, his refusal to follow predictable patterns of complaint or acceptance meant he consistently received better treatment and faster resolution of issues. But the personal applications were even more profound. In his relationships, Marcus found that people could no longer take his presence for granted or assume they knew how he would respond to various situations. This created a dynamic where others had to remain genuinely engaged with him as a person rather than relating to their mental model of who they expected him to be. His romantic relationships, in particular, were transformed. Previous partners had learned to predict his responses and had gradually stopped seeing him as a mystery worth exploring. They knew exactly which topics would make him uncomfortable, which approaches would get them what they wanted, and which behaviors he would tolerate regardless of how they affected him. But the person Marcus had become could not be mapped or predicted in this way. Partners found themselves needing to actually communicate rather than simply pushing predictable buttons. They had to remain curious about his thoughts and feelings rather than assuming they already knew them. The depth and vitality of his relationships increased exponentially as a result. The spiritual implications of this transformation were equally significant. Marcus realized that what most people call personal growth is actually the process of becoming more sophisticated in their limitations rather than transcending those limitations entirely. They learn to manage their weaknesses rather than destroy them, to cope with their patterns rather than eliminate them, to work around their limitations rather than move beyond them. True transformation, he understood, required the complete destruction of the weak self, not through violence or self-hatred, but through the systematic elimination of predictable responses that no longer served his highest potential. Every time he chose growth over comfort, truth over convenience, or principle over expediency, he was destroying another aspect of his weak self and strengthening his capacity for authentic response. This process had revealed that the strong self is not a thing to be built but a capacity to be freed. Underneath all the limiting patterns, defensive behaviors, and predictable responses was an essential nature capable of wisdom, creativity, and appropriate action in any situation. The work was not to create this capacity but to remove the obstacles that prevented it from expressing itself. The man who had once been entirely predictable in his weakness had become entirely unpredictable in his strength. Colleagues, friends, family members, and even strangers found themselves treating him with a natural respect that arose not from fear or manipulation, but from their recognition that they were encountering someone who could not be easily categorized, controlled, or dismissed. This respect was not demanded or earned through traditional means, it was evoked by the simple presence of someone who had transcended their own limitations. When people encountered Marcus, they sensed they were dealing with someone operating from a different paradigm, someone who could not be predicted or controlled through the usual social and psychological mechanisms. The ultimate irony was that by becoming unpredictable in his responses, Marcus had become completely reliable in his character. People knew they could count on him to act with integrity, but they could not predict exactly how that integrity would manifest in any given situation. They knew he would pursue excellence, but they could not anticipate the specific form that pursuit would take. They trusted his commitment to growth, but they could not forecast which directions that growth might lead him. This combination of character reliability and response unpredictability had created something rare in human experience, a person who could be trusted completely but never taken for granted. Someone who could be counted on absolutely but never controlled or manipulated. An individual who had become truly unassailable not through the accumulation of power or the construction of defenses, but through the elimination of the predictable weaknesses that made attack possible in the first place. The journey from predictable weakness to unpredictable strength had revealed that the greatest battles are not fought against external enemies but against the internal patterns that make us vulnerable to those enemies. The person who conquers themselves, who systematically destroys every aspect of their weak self that can be predicted, manipulated, or defeated, becomes invincible not because nothing can challenge them, but because they cannot be predictably defeated by anything. In a world where most people remain trapped in predictable patterns of response, the individual who has transcended their own predictability possesses a form of power that no external force can diminish. They have become the author of their own responses rather than the prisoner of their programming. They have achieved the ultimate freedom, the liberty to respond to any situation from a place of strength, wisdom, and authentic choice rather than from the constraints of fear, habit, or expectation. Marcus understood now that this was not the end of his journey but its true beginning. Having destroyed his weak self, he was free to discover what lay beyond weakness and strength, beyond predictability and unpredictability, beyond the familiar categories that had once defined the boundaries of his existence. He had become someone even he could not fully predict, and in that mystery lay infinite possibility for continued growth, contribution, and authentic living. The man who destroys his weak self, Marcus had learned, can never be destroyed by others because he has already eliminated everything within himself that made destruction possible. What remains is not a fortress but a river, fluid, adaptive, and ultimately unstoppable in its movement toward its chosen destination.